The political ideology known as Marxist-Leninism was one of the most pervasive and infamous movements of the 20th century. In the 21st century, countries such as Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, and China are all one-party socialist republics who had their revolutions in societies with massive peasant populations and agrarian economies. But what is Leninism? And how did Lenin consolidate power to found such an influential and feared revolutionary movement? In this film, we will explore the power struggle at the heart of the early Soviet Union, and how Lenin created a strategy for a small group of committed radicals to seize their government, entice their people, and create a monolithic single-party communist state where no dissent is allowed. When the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party convened in Moscow in March 1921, it marked a historic turning point. For the first time since the revolution began, Lenin could address his comrades without the shadow of enemy armies on Soviet soil. After 3.5 years of relentless civil war, the military phase of the revolution was finally winding down. The Bolsheviks had achieved their immediate objectives. The workers' state had survived, and through the newly established Comintern, they had planted the seeds of international revolution. But now they faced an equally daunting challenge: the peaceful reconstruction of a shattered nation. The scale of this task was staggering. The civil war had not merely devastated Russia's economy and infrastructure, it had torn apart the very fabric of society and fundamentally altered its class composition. For a party grounded in Marxist theory, understanding this transformed social landscape was crucial before any effective policies could be developed. The complexity of this challenge was reflected in the internal state of the party itself. An extraordinary abundance of platforms, tendencies, cliques, and sub-ideologies circulated among the membership, indicating that the Bolsheviks were still struggling to analyze and adapt to their new reality. This proliferation of competing viewpoints revealed a party grappling with its transition from revolutionary force to governing body. With characteristic insight, Lenin recognized the historic significance of the 10th Party Congress, a moment that would fundamentally reshape Soviet history. The Congress launched several transformative policies that would permanently alter the relationship between the party, state apparatus, and Soviet society. 3 major initiatives emerged: a prohibition on organized factions within the party, a redefinition of trade unions' role in the socialist state, and the introduction of the new economic policy. These controversial decisions would ignite fierce debates within the party that would persist throughout the decade. The Congress would need to address not just the practical challenges of reconstruction, but also how to build socialism in a country whose social structure had been completely upended by years of warfare and revolution. It was against this backdrop of sweeping policy changes that new guidelines emerged for the party's rank-and-file members and their basic organizations, fundamentally reshaping Soviet political dynamics. Yet the Congress convened under ominous circumstances. In late February 1921, what began as a minor labor dispute at Petrograd's Trubochny factory escalated into a significant crisis. The initial incident involved limited clashes between workers and Red Fleet cadets guarding the facility. When workers from the nearby Baltic shipyards joined in solidarity, the situation intensified with an unsuccessful attempt to raid a local armory. Though this initial disturbance was contained, it sparked something far more serious. On February 28th, the crew of the battleship Petropavlovsk mutinied, calling for a third revolution to overthrow what they termed the Commissar regime. Events reached a critical point the next day at Kronstadt, the naval fortress city, where a mass gathering at Anchor Square elected a revolutionary committee. Their demands were both political and economic. They called for Soviets without communists, the restoration of civil liberties, and freedom to trade. The situation took a decisive turn when the committee arrested approximately 600 Communist Party members, including Nikolai Kuzmin, the Baltic Fleet's commissar, who had arrived to negotiate. The scale of the Kronstadt uprising was staggering. 2 battleships, over 100 coastal artillery batteries, and approximately 27,000 sailors and soldiers stood in rebellion against Bolshevik rule. For the Soviet government, this represented an existential threat to their authority, forcing them to declare a state of siege in Petrograd. After failed negotiations on March 8th, the government moved decisively. The 7th Army, numbering more than 40,000 troops, launched a brutal assault that would crush the rebellion within 10 days. The timing was particularly significant. This crisis erupted while the 10th Party Congress was in session, creating a dramatic spectacle of a former Bolshevik stronghold rising against the party. The situation was so dire that Congress delegates themselves were dispatched to Petrograd, first as negotiators, then as soldiers in the assault on Kronstadt. Among these delegates was Naval Commissar Ivan Sladkov of the Fort Krasnoflotsky. His March 7th report to Ephraim Skliansky provides crucial insight into how party loyalists viewed the uprising. Sladkov blamed left socialist revolutionary agitators for manipulating the sailors, claiming they had surrendered command to white officers bent on counter-revolution. In his view, military force was the only remaining option. Lenin himself saw even greater dangers in the Kronstadt uprising. Addressing the 10th Congress, he characterized it as a petty bourgeois counter-revolution, more threatening than all the white generals combined. His reasoning was strategic. In a country where the majority were war-ravaged peasants, military demobilization was creating a vast pool of potential rebels. Under these conditions, even seemingly moderate demands for free trade could quickly evolve into counter-revolutionary movements threatening Soviet power. The Kronstadt uprising thus represented more than just a military crisis. It exposed the fundamental tensions within the young Soviet state, forcing the Bolsheviks to confront difficult questions about authority, discipline, and the nature of revolutionary power. At the heart of Lenin's Congress speech lay a crucial challenge. How could the party reconcile with Russia's vast masses who formed the majority of the population? The issue was most acute with the peasantry. These primary producers, emerging from years of war, exhausted and armed, but still vital to feeding the cities, represented both an essential ally and a potential threat. The Bolsheviks needed their grain, but had little to offer in return. Lenin proposed a bold solution: abolish the wartime policy of forced grain requisitioning in favor of a tax which could be paid in goods, while simultaneously opening specific sectors to foreign investment. This would create a viable economic cycle. Peasants could sell their surplus produce and use the proceeds to purchase goods from state industries, jump-started by foreign capital. Through careful state management, this controlled market exchange would both develop industry and diffuse the revolutionary appeal of free trade demands. However, the peasantry wasn't the only challenge to revolutionary authority. Lenin identified a second threat: the motley bureaucratic makeup of the post-war government. This bureaucratic degeneration manifested in 2 ways. First, through state officials who neither came from working-class backgrounds nor held communist sympathies. And second, through the corruption networks that had emerged from economic collapse, where officials became bribable out of either necessity or opportunism. These bureaucrats couldn't be trusted to rebuild the economy, and worse, were alienating the regime from its working-class base. Lenin argued the solution to this dual crisis of unreliable peasants and corrupt bureaucrats, lay in strengthening party control over the state apparatus, while simultaneously becoming more responsive to workers' needs. This would require extraordinary party unity and discipline. Yet at precisely this moment the party was fracturing. The often satirized tendency for leftists to fracture their own coalitions in theoretical debates was threatening the precarious victory of the communists. In response, the Central Committee took decisive action, passing the On-Party Unity Resolution, which banned organized factions within the party and made fighting factionalism a top priority. This marked a crucial turning point. Faced with external threats and internal divisions, the party chose unity over debate and discipline over democracy. Yet even as Lenin secured these victories, powerful voices of dissent emerged from within the party itself. The most significant challenge came from the workers' opposition, a group of Moscow-based leaders who feared the party was abandoning its working-class roots. First appearing in February 1920, when its members gained control of the Tula Provincial Committee. The opposition rapidly gathered support among disillusioned workers by advocating democratization of Soviet institutions and direct worker control of production. Led by prominent figures like metal worker Sergei Medvedev and former Labour Commissar Alexei Shliapnikov, the opposition built a formidable coalition through strategic alliances and aggressive campaigning. Their breakthrough came when they won support from the Metal Workers' Union's Central Committee, demonstrating their appeal to industrial workers. The theoretical foundation of their movement was laid out by Alexandra Kollontai in a pivotal Pravda pamphlet, published January 25, 1920. While agreeing with Lenin that Russia's petty bourgeois character threatened socialist development, Kollontai identified a different core problem: the growing divide between rank-and-file party activists and an increasingly detached leadership. She argued that party leaders had lost touch with workers, filling key positions with careerists more interested in personal advancement than socialist transformation. The workers' opposition proposed a radical solution, fundamentally restructuring the relationship between party, state, and society. They called for the party to step back from administrative control and return to its original role as the working class's intellectual and educational leader. This meant eliminating the party's power to appoint officials in favor of democratic elections at all levels. Most radically, they demanded that trade unions take control of industrial management, from individual factories all the way up to national economic planning. This was more than just an internal party dispute. It represented a fundamental debate about the nature of socialist power. Could revolutionary goals be achieved through centralized authority, or did true socialism require genuine worker control? The answer would shape not just Soviet society, but influence revolutionary movements worldwide. Lenin's response to the workers' opposition was both cutting and calculated. In his concluding remarks to the Central Committee, he sarcastically recommended Kollontai's pamphlet as the best material against the workers' opposition itself. He dismissed their core proposal that trade union assemblies could manage national production and planning. Are they joking? Can we take these people seriously? Yet beneath this mockery lay a serious argument about power and pragmatism. While acknowledging that bureaucratism plagued the party, Lenin branded the opposition's solutions as dangerously naive. The party couldn't implement consistent democratism, he argued, because we are too weak. In Lenin's view, loosening party control over state administration would fatally undermine both the Soviet state and the revolution itself. He drew a pointed parallel, describing the workers' opposition as an intra-party Kronstadt, effectively branding them as internal enemies of the revolution. The opposition fought back against these characterizations. They maintained their loyalty to the Central Committee, insisting their goal was to strengthen, not weaken the party. They claimed they were bridging the growing gap between leadership and rank-and-file workers. They had never sought to create a separate organization. Their concerns reflected a deeper tension within Bolshevism, the clash between their original vision of bottom-up revolutionary politics and the compromises required to maintain power. Shliapnikov, one of their leaders, poignantly noted that the party had lost the unity and camaraderie that had characterized its underground days. Despite the opposition's comprehensive defeat at the Congress, their influence couldn't be entirely dismissed. Their rapid rise and the credibility of their working-class leadership suggested their concerns resonated widely within the party. Lenin, recognizing this, promised to incorporate valuable elements of their critique while rejecting their specific proposals. The dual challenge presented by Kronstadt and the workers' opposition would shape party policy throughout the early NEP period. Lenin's Congress interventions essentially reaffirmed governance principles he'd outlined in The Immediate Tasks of Soviet Power at the Civil War's start. Experience had proven that the idealistic vision of a commune state was impractical. Effective governance required professional administrators and clear chains of command. The challenge of bureaucratism could only be addressed through carefully managed mass participation, popular involvement that wouldn't undermine executive authority. This was the delicate balance the party would need to maintain. Enough popular participation to prevent bureaucratic ossification, but not so much as to threaten central control. The resolution of this tension would define the character of Soviet power for decades to come. Despite protests from Shliapnikov, Kollontai, and their allies, Lenin maintained that the original conditions necessitating Bolshevik policy remained unchanged. However, he acknowledged that civil war exigencies had forced the party to neglect crucial aspects of its initial political vision. To address this imbalance, the Congress adopted two pivotal resolutions on the role and tasks of trade unions and on questions of party building. These documents reaffirmed the party's political direction since 1918, while recognizing that wartime circumstances had imposed military-style organization on both party and unions. Peace now demanded a shift toward greater workers' democracy in these foundational Soviet institutions. The trade union controversy had erupted in mid-1920 when, under Trotsky's leadership, the Central Committee consolidated rail and water transport unions into a single state-controlled entity. Trotsky's subsequent proposal to extend this model across all unions, as part of a broader strategy to militarize labor for economic recovery, met strong opposition. While Lenin and most Central Committee members rejected Trotsky's authoritarian vision, his radical position ironically energized the workers' opposition, prompting them to develop their own competing program. The Central Committee's final resolution on trade unions charted a middle course between two extremes: the workers' opposition's vision of union-controlled industry and Trotsky's plan for state-absorbed unions. Instead, they conceptualized unions as schools of communism, spaces where workers would develop the capabilities and habits necessary to eventually manage their state. While rejecting direct union control of industry, the resolution granted unions significant influence over industrial organization. The new framework gave unions authority over crucial aspects of labor management, including determining skill classifications, establishing work norms, and overseeing resource allocation and workforce distribution. Unions would participate in economic planning and management selection while promoting technical education and identifying promising workers for advancement to executive positions. However, this expanded role came with increased responsibility. Unions would need to maintain strict labor discipline, combat absenteeism, and prevent theft of factory equipment. This carefully balanced approach aimed to give workers meaningful participation in industrial management, while preserving central party control over strategic decisions. It represented a practical compromise between revolutionary ideals and the demands of governing a vast state. These contradictory impulses would come to define the Soviet Union. The new system created a complex balancing act for trade unions. They were to share industrial administration duties without being subordinate to management, while simultaneously acting as a check on managerial power without gaining supremacy over it. To maintain this delicate and potentially impossible equilibrium, union leadership would remain in the hands of trusted Communist Party members, who were meant to both protect unions from management overreach, and prevent their drift toward anarcho-syndicalism, an ideology where trade unions are free to implement their own communist policies. Particularly significant was the resolution's focus on party cells, the basic units where most members exercised their rights and duties. Strengthening these grassroots organizations was deemed essential for bridging the gap between leadership and rank-and-file members. Factory-based cells would expand beyond political education to become, quote, militant organs of the party's economic work, unquote. Members would actively participate in trade union committees and economic control bodies, thereby leading non-party workers by example. The continual paradox the Communist Party found itself in was that it needed to extract productivity for the faltering economy. But it also needed to protect the workers from its own managerial excesses to gain its legitimacy and members from the industrial proletariat. Party cells thus became the crucial institutional bridge between the party and its social foundation. The importance of this organizational restructuring was reflected in the unprecedented attention it received at the 10th Congress, where party-building discussions consumed 3 of 16 sessions and engaged 17 speakers. Even the opposition, represented on the drafting committee, supported the resolution, a rare moment of unity revealing that despite their fierce debates, all Bolshevik factions still viewed their party as the working class's legitimate representative and revolution's natural leader. These Congress resolutions on trade unions and party building fundamentally reshaped relationships between the party, its working class base, and state apparatus. Party building focused on recruiting and politically educating new members, which became a permanent preoccupation. More significantly, the new partnership between unions and management created a distinctive Soviet institution, the industrial triangle. This triangle assigned clear roles to each participant. Factory administrators handled planning, resource management, and workforce deployment. Trade unions faced the more nuanced challenge of protecting worker interests and providing services while participating in labor management. The party served as the system's keystone, preventing conflicts between the other 2 vertices from disrupting production. Within the party framework, communist workers and union officials could engage factory directors as equals, finding compromise through shared party principles. The industrial triangle wasn't merely 3 separate organizations working together. It represented a complex interweaving of party, state, and society. Some historians have interpreted this arrangement as the revolution's failure, seeing it as a conspiracy between party, unions, and management that stripped workers of independent representation. Indeed, during the NEP period, unions often worked to prevent strikes and contain labor militancy, and their declining membership in the early 1920s suggested diminished worker trust. However, dismissing the triangle as merely a scheme for worker control oversimplifies its role. While it did restrain militant labor activism, unions continued to advocate for workers' interests, successfully mediating labor disputes and maintaining workplace safety standards while supporting unemployed workers. The triangle represented a pragmatic attempt to balance revolutionary ideals with industrial necessity, creating a distinctively Soviet approach to labor relations that would influence socialist systems worldwide. When the 10th Congress concluded in early 1921, the much-discussed industrial triangle remained theoretical. The Civil War had gutted trade unions as workers fled cities en masse seeking survival in the countryside. This declassing of the proletariat, while deeply troubling to Bolshevik theorists, seemed likely to reverse once economic recovery drew workers back to factories and unions. The party's situation, however, posed a more complex challenge. Its reconstruction couldn't be left to market forces or bureaucratic planning. The party needed to actively reshape itself into the revolutionary vanguard its leaders envisioned. The Central Committee launched this transformation in summer 1921 with 2 interconnected initiatives: comprehensive membership purge and an all-Russian party census. These measures would assess local party membership strength, while also giving the opportunity to cleanse these memberships of political threats. The purge targeted two groups: opportunistic also communists, who had joined after victory, and genuine proletarian revolutionaries, who had strayed from Bolshevism. This cleansing aimed to accomplish three goals: preserving Bolshevik ideological purity while restoring rank-and-file trust by dismantling networks of corruption and convenience, and instill fear in anyone who would think of opposing the Bolsheviks' consolidation of communist rule. Notably, local organizations were instructed to involve non-party workers in identifying unreliable elements, a move that both legitimized the process and engaged the working class. The accompanying census employed sophisticated methodology developed by the Central Committee's Statistical Department. It used separate forms for individual members, cells, and party committees. Individual questionnaires were remarkably detailed, with 59 fields covering not just basic demographics like class, age, and nationality, but also revolutionary credentials such as labor movement participation and imprisonment for underground activities. The census thus served as an additional filtering mechanism, with membership cards confiscated from those deemed unsuitable. The results proved sobering. Party membership plummeted from approximately 710,000 at the purge's start to just under 500,000 at its conclusion. Further cuts during the census and additional purges in remote areas reduced numbers even more dramatically by late 1922. Official membership stood at roughly 410,000. Nearly half the party had been eliminated, raising serious questions about its ability to lead the revolution forward. The party purge's impact proved devastating. Within a year, more than a third of members had either been expelled or resigned preemptively. More troubling still, the workers' opposition's warnings about the party's declining working-class influence appeared increasingly prescient. In the capital cities, only 27 of every 1,000 inhabitants were Communist Party members, while other industrial regions of central Russia showed even more alarming figures of barely 5 per thousand. Once mighty factory organizations, former bastions of Bolshevism, had withered to mere hundreds among thousands of workers. Though statistics showed workers still constituting over half of party membership, deeper analysis revealed a more disturbing reality. Many worker members had actually left the factory floor for party or management positions. Even in Moscow and Petrograd, genuine workers composed only 15% of the membership. Confronting this crisis, the Bolshevik leadership launched an aggressive party-building campaign. The 11th Party Congress in March 1922 passed the resolution called "On the Strengthening of the Party," which not only reinforced previous directives but introduced significant innovations. The new policy created stricter entry requirements for non-workers, while demanding factory-based organizations take bolder stands for workers' interests against management. To strengthen workplace presence, secretaries of party organizations in large factories became full-time paid positions, freed from other duties. New district party committees were established to coordinate these factory-level organizations in urban areas. By mid-1922, while the lower party structure had taken clear shape, fundamental problems remained. The purge had successfully removed Civil War-era deadwood, but the census had starkly exposed the party's separation from its working-class foundations. Despite the 11th Congress's grassroots reorientation, an uncomfortable truth remained. Soviet factories simply lacked sufficient communist presence. The solution would emerge in late 1923, marking a dramatic shift from emphasizing quality to pursuing quantity. A watershed moment came in December 1923, when the Politburo and Central Control Commission jointly approved recruiting workers actively engaged in production. This initiative gained new significance after Lenin's death in January 1924, becoming the Lenin Levy. This recruitment drive carried both practical and symbolic weight, aiming to rebuild working-class connections while honoring Lenin's legacy. In a bizarre and early example of the cult of personality phenomenon, which would become ubiquitous in later Leninist regimes, prospective members declared their intent to join at public factory gatherings before Lenin's funeral portraits, creating a quasi-religious ritual of political commitment. The party dramatically simplified its recruitment process, abandoning the requirement for existing member recommendations in favor of simple majority votes by workers at factory meetings. This opening of membership produced remarkable results. By 1926, the Lenin Levy had brought in 500,000 new members, with an unprecedented 92% being active production workers and 80% classified as skilled labor. The momentum continued with the October recruitment campaign in 1926, commemorating the revolution's 10th anniversary, which attracted an additional 100,000 candidates. This 3-year recruitment drive transformed the party, more than doubling its membership. The earlier crisis of working-class representation had reversed dramatically, as workers flooded into the grassroots organizations established in the early 1920s. Primary party organizations in major industrial facilities exploded, from just hundreds of members in 1922 to thousands by 1926. Factory party meetings evolved from intimate gatherings into mass events that marked the rhythm of industrial life. Lenin's vision of a proletarian vanguard had seemingly materialized, though the challenge remained of integrating these new members into Bolshevik political culture and mobilizing them for socialist construction. Yet this membership expansion occurred against a backdrop of continuing political tension. Despite the defeat of the workers' opposition and the ban on factions, challenges to leadership continued. In the aftermath of the 10th Congress, Shliapnikov and his allies shifted their strategy, working to expand their influence within trade unions. They aimed to push unions toward more aggressive use of their authority, hoping to advance their vision of direct worker management. The opposition found new energy in responding to the party's evolving economic policy, particularly its move from limited peasant concessions toward broader market mechanisms and private property rights under NEP. Shliapnikov initially tried working within the system, bringing his concerns directly to the Politburo. He warned against dependence on foreign capital and argued that profit-driven industrial policy would alienate the party from workers. When the Supreme Council of the People's Economy rejected his NEP-related proposals, Shliapnikov's group began more active organizing, speaking at factory meetings and campaigning in unions. They carefully maintained their organizational presence by accepting transfers and demotions when faced with party discipline. The opposition even took their struggle international, twice bringing their NEP criticisms before the Comintern. Beyond Shliapnikov's moderate dissent, more radical voices emerged. Some viewed his response as too tepid in the face of fundamental betrayals of communist principles. These militant oppositionists defied the faction ban, forming organized groups that pushed the worker-centered agenda already condemned at the 10th Congress. The most extreme manifestation came from Vasily Panyushkin's Worker-Peasant Socialist Party, which completely rejected Bolshevism and echoed Kronstadt's revolutionary demands, calling for workers untainted by betrayal to seize control of the Soviets. Meanwhile, the student-driven Workers' Truth Group developed a sophisticated critique, theorizing that the Bolshevik Party had become an incubator for a new technical bureaucratic bourgeoisie. A more nuanced position emerged from Gavril Myasnikov's Workers' Group in Perm. While not dismissing the party as counter-revolutionary, they argued that NEP, without the freedom for workers to organize in their own defense, could become a gateway to a new exploitative system. Their criticism focused not on rejecting the party outright, but on the dangers posed to the revolution by unchecked economic liberalization without safeguards for workers' democracy. Though these ultra-left opponents of NEP never seriously threatened Bolshevik control, the response was swift and severe. The Cheka efficiently suppressed the smaller radical groups, while the party's disciplinary machinery constrained even prominent oppositionists like Shliapnikov. His predicament came to a head in August 1921, when a joint session of the Central Committee and Central Control Commission examined whether he had violated the faction ban. The trigger was a denunciation from a Moscow hydroelectric plant worker, who reported Shliapnikov's alleged statement that the party had become petty bourgeois and was driving workers to thievery. Though he retained his Central Committee membership, the threat of expulsion severely limited his influence. His subsequent defeats in union and party battles, followed by the 11th Congress's condemnation of his Comintern appeal, effectively ended his opposition. The contrasting fates of these opposition leaders revealed much about the evolving Soviet system. Myasnikov and Paniushkin, hardened revolutionary fighters known for their Civil War ruthlessness, proved unable to adapt to the compromises of peacetime politics. Shliapnikov, though more politically sophisticated and committed to working within the system, found himself increasingly marginalized. That such diverse figures would all oppose NEP so quickly after its introduction demonstrated just how dramatically it departed from traditional Bolshevik economic thinking. Yet the real crisis wasn't the content of the new economic policy, but rather the political system's inability to accommodate meaningful opposition to the leadership's compromise with market forces. Having vanquished their enemies in the Civil War, the Bolsheviks established absolute political control over the Soviet Republic. The ban on factions meant any organized opposition to party policy faced either state repression or party discipline. Those who rejected NEP found themselves challenging Lenin and his self-evident talents for realizing his vision of communism. After the 11th Congress firmly condemned such demands, opposition appeared crushed, until cracks in the leadership itself spawned an even deeper crisis. October 1923 marked a turning point when Trotsky sent his fateful letter to the Central Committee and Central Control Commission, criticizing their economic management. Within a week, 46 prominent communists, including Central Committee members, issued a supporting declaration. This declaration of the 46 went further, attacking the, quote, inner party regime, end quote, of bureaucratic appointments as a mechanism for maintaining the Politburo's factional dictatorship. They demanded an emergency conference, bringing together the Central Committee and dissenting party leaders to resolve the mounting crisis. Trotsky's emergence as a champion of democracy seemed paradoxical, given his history of dismissing constitutional rights and his recent advocacy for militarized labor. His break with the Politburo stemmed more from frustration with NEP's limitations. As head of the Heavy Industry Commission, he had struggled to sustain large, unprofitable enterprises within the new market framework. His spring 1923 report to the 12th Party Congress warned of NEP's fundamental flaw: the widening price gap between industrial and agricultural products, the scissors crisis. This divergence meant peasant production couldn't generate enough tax revenue to fund industry, especially given the costly subsidies required to maintain struggling factories. Trotsky had urged both the Central Committee and Politburo to adopt comprehensive economic planning and shift agricultural policy from private to state farming, essentially abandoning NEP. When both bodies rejected his proposals and a special congressional commission on industrial financing followed suit, Trotsky apparently concluded that achieving his economic vision required restructuring the political system itself. The leak of his letter and the declaration following these defeats revealed a calculated escalation. Having failed to change policy through normal channels, Trotsky sought to reshape the political framework that had blocked his reforms. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Soviet political struggle, one that would pit competing visions of socialism against each other within the leadership itself. In his confrontations with party leadership, Trotsky advocated for a fundamental restructuring of party governance. He championed universal elections over appointed positions and pushed for collective expression of dissenting views, though carefully avoiding direct challenges to the faction ban. These negotiations culminated in a compromise resolution, unanimously adopted by a joint session of the Politburo and Central Control Commission Presidium on December 5, 1924. The document affirmed workers' democracy as essential to party development, endorsing open discussion of political issues and electoral selection of officials at all levels. However, the resolution contained significant qualifications. While supporting free discussion, it explicitly prohibited any drift toward factionalism. Though elections were endorsed as the primary method for filling leadership positions, higher party bodies retained both oversight of elected officials and the right to make direct appointments in so-called special circumstances. These restrictions were framed as temporary measures that would naturally fade as party building and socialist development resolved political tensions. The resolution also introduced the mass recruitment of industrial workers that would become the Lenin levy. Beyond this shift toward quantity over quality in recruitment, the resolution largely reaffirmed existing party policies. Yet Trotsky, perhaps seeing opportunity in this very continuity, claimed victory and immediately launched fresh attacks on the leadership. Days after the document's release, he published the new course in Pravda on December 11th, framing the resolution as the leadership's tacit admission that major political changes were needed. He criticized conservatively predisposed comrades who overvalued bureaucratic apparatus while undervaluing the party's spontaneous grassroots action. Most provocatively, he called on younger members to become more politically active to prevent the degeneration of the old guard. This was Trotsky's decisive move, positioning himself as the champion of youth and renewal against an entrenched bureaucratic elite. He presented himself as the leader of a revitalizing force, challenging the leadership's bureaucratic stagnation. This bold stance triggered escalating confrontations between the opposition and party leadership, playing out in press debates and party meetings leading up to the 13th conference in early 1924. The strategy revealed Trotsky's political acumen, but also his vulnerability. By appealing to youth against the old guard, he risked alienating experienced party cadres while potentially undermining the very institutional stability needed for his economic reforms. His challenge forced the party to confront fundamental questions about democracy, leadership renewal, and the balance between discipline and debate. This pivotal political battle played out in public view, with opposition platforms appearing in both central and regional party publications. Pre-conference meetings became forums for open criticism, with archival records revealing heated exchanges, where oppositionists accused the majority of using their institutional control to pursue policies that risk capitalist restoration. Trotsky's support base proved revealing. He found strong backing in the student-heavy Moscow party organization, and even secured support from working-class strongholds like the Chelyabinsk City Committee. Yet these isolated victories couldn't overcome the majority's dominance. The opposition faced decisive defeats, first at the 13th conference, where it was branded a petty bourgeois deviation, then definitively at the 13th Congress in May 1924. Yet the battle's significance lay not in its outcome, but in its framework as a debate over workers' democracy in party building. Paradoxically, the left opposition's platform barely diverged from the Central Committee's majority position. Trotsky proposed no specific constitutional changes to either the Soviet state or party structure. His vision of democratization remained firmly within single-party parameters, accepting both the ban on factions and centralized authority. His new course offered only the nebulous formulation that democratization was the party subordinating its own apparatus to itself, while not for a single minute ceasing to be a centralized organization. Beyond vague, it calls for permanent interaction of the old generation with the new. He offered no concrete mechanisms to preserve revolutionary spirit. This theoretical flimsiness suggests Trotsky's democratic platform served primarily as a vehicle for advancing his economic agenda. The Central Committee majority certainly saw through this strategy, accusing him of manufacturing political differences to pursue personal objectives. Yet regardless of Trotsky's true motives, his weaponization of party democracy paradoxically strengthened the leadership's emphasis on party discipline. The debate exposed fundamental contradictions in Soviet political development. How could the party maintain both democratic vitality and centralized control? Could meaningful reform occur within such narrow ideological constraints? Trotsky's failure suggested the system's structural resistance to change, even when challenged from within the highest leadership ranks. While all Bolsheviks endorsed workers' democracy in principle, with the Lenin levy serving as evidence of the majority's commitment to youth involvement, the opposition's fatal flaw lay in challenging party unity. This Trotskyist tendency increasingly earned condemnation as a petty bourgeois deviation for undermining what leadership defined as an equally essential element of Leninism, monolithic unity. This ideological battle played out not just at the 13th Congress, but more significantly through a network of new journals and newspapers designed to shape the political consciousness of new party members. Stalin articulated this new political framework in his influential Sverdlov University lectures, later published as On the Foundations of Leninism. In it, he characterized the party as an organized detachment of the working class, tasked with instilling in the masses both a robust work ethic and systematic approach to production and politics. To fulfill this mission, the party itself had to embody organization and discipline. Stalin's key theoretical innovation was defining Leninism as the synthesis of Russian revolutionary fervor with American professionalism. Revolutionary fervor served as the revitalizing force that awakens thought, presses ahead, and smashes the past, while professionalism provided the essential anchor to concrete reality, preventing revolutionary energy from degrading into empty rhetoric and ultimately self-defeating policy. The dedication of Stalin's foundations to the Lenin levy proved strategically significant. New members entered the party during a leadership struggle that increasingly portrayed Bolshevism as prioritizing unity over open debate. Opposition gradually became synonymous with deviation, at best a distraction from practical work, at worst evidence of hostile class influences infiltrating the party. Democracy would now operate strictly within the bounds of discipline, while revolutionary fervor, though valued, required the restraining influence of professionalism. The party leadership, naturally, would maintain this delicate balance. This reformulation effectively established the ideological framework for the next phase of party building. As thousands of workers joined the party's ranks, they encountered an organization where unity trumped debate, discipline defined the limits of democracy, and the leadership's role in maintaining ideological balance went unquestioned. Stalin's theoretical contribution thus provided the foundation for a more hierarchical and disciplined party structure, fundamentally reshaping Soviet political culture for decades to come. In his final major Congress speech, Lenin offered a crucial assessment of the Bolsheviks' governing challenge. We are still a drop in the ocean amongst the popular masses, and we can govern only insofar as we express correctly what the people are already conscious of. Otherwise, the party will not be leading the proletariat will not be leading the masses, and the whole system will fall apart. This statement, later emphasized by Stalin in his interpretations of Leninism, captured the fundamental dilemma of the vanguard party in power. The Bolsheviks represented a tiny minority of the USSR's population. Their political survival and growth depended on winning mass trust through enacting the revolutionary mandate, while simultaneously not alienating the unaffiliated majority. This concept would eventually become enshrined in Soviet and other socialist states' constitutions as the party's leading role in society. Though in the Soviet Republic's early years, its practical implications remained unclear. In the later 20th century, and still today, the societal primacy of the Communist Party as an institutional elite would be a defining feature of Leninist regimes. Despite their fierce rhetorical battles, both oppositionists and majority supporters remained united in their vision of an authoritarian communism, a system where a single ruling party would govern and enact their vision of communism that could not be legitimately challenged. The so-called democratic opposition was in favor of a more dogmatic vision of communism, where they hoped worker representation in the government would prevent degenerating policies like NEP. Vanguardism was the inevitable result of a communist revolution in a country without large-scale public enthusiasm. Ultimately, Lenin's assessment that the communist position at the top of Russian society was not strong enough to allow for factions and debate, one out. This underlying agreement on fundamentals, even among supposed opponents, effectively established the basic framework for party-state society relations that would define the Soviet system. Democracy meant involvement in execution rather than decision-making, consultation rather than contestation, participation within prescribed limits rather than open-ended political struggle. Thus, while the details of Soviet governance remained to be worked out, its essential character was already set. A one-party state that would maintain power indefinitely while claiming to rule in the people's interest. The various opposition movements, by accepting these parameters even as they fought within them, helped legitimize this distinctive and infamous political system.